Hi and welcome to Working Together to Get Things Done, a view from different disciplines. This is the South East branch of the RTPI as part of the online series of 2020 brought to you by the RTPI. Just a note before we start, if you'd like to have a look at the handout section on your control panel, you can find links to the RTPI work and the speakers' work related to this session in the downloadable form. I'm Steve Lees, I'm an independent planning consultant, and today we've got four very good speakers across a number of disciplines: archaeology, heritage, ecology, architecture, and local authority head of planning. So hopefully today we're going to cover some interesting ground. I think we've got some case studies and one or two maybe anecdotes will creep out as well. To give you a little bit of homework, all of you joined us, and indeed the speakers. I've got the following piece of work to do, and it's a question, and the question is, what one thing would you do yourself to improve working together with others in the area of planning in which you work? You can put your answers on the chat function, and you can also send us your questions, because we've got time later on for a Q&A, hopefully if the speakers don't overrun by too much. The four speakers, I keep saying three, the four speakers are Kasan, who's an architect and director at Clay Architecture. The second speaker is Georgina, Timmis, a principal ecologist at ECOSA. Our third speaker is Esther Robinson, who's a historic environment consultant at Robinson Wild, and I think you should change the name and turn it the other way around to be more fun. And our fourth speaker and final speaker is Paul Jackson, who's head of planning at Test Valley Borough Council in Hampshire. I'm going to ask each of them in turn when they start their presentation just to say a little bit more about them. And I think our first speaker is ready to go, and that is Kasan.
Oh, hello. Oh. So here we go. Hi, I'm Kasan from Clay Architecture. I'm a chartered architect and principal at Clay Architecture, a small practice based in North Kent. I want to start talking today about the three-point process of planning as I see it. On the one side, we have the needs of the client and the project. And then you've got the checks and balances provided by the planner and their team of consultees, and the design team, sometimes led by an architect, dealing with the solutions for the site. So it's a kind of a push and pull between the requirements of the three. Sometimes the needs of the project and the needs of the client are such that you have to take on the more challenging route in planning terms in order to get a solution. And this is where collaboration comes into its own between these processes here. The case study that I want to use to demonstrate this is a case study for Winery, which is this site on the side of the hill. It's a 22-acre vineyard on the hillside with no on-site facilities, but only because of constraints, only 5 acres are currently cultivated with vines, and they're seeking to expand. The success of the vineyard depends on having an on-site winery and a visitor center for wine tourism. Issues at the pre-app stage: we inherited the project, a scheme by another architect who retired. So what he obtained from his scheme was a very useful, detailed 9-page response from the local authority during the pre-app process. Some of the points that were brought up by them was the landscape impact. He had a 6-meter-high building within the green belt and adjacent to the AONB. A large part of the site crosses into a local wildlife area. There are no existing buildings or structures that he could piggyback the scheme on, and the highways were concerned about potential visitor center traffic. The main route into the site is a small country lane. So there were a lot of bullets that we could dodge, but because of the needs of the project, we actually decided to confront them straight on. The first one was the size of the building. The building that was submitted at pre-app was actually too small. Once we did the space planning, and once we did, this is a photograph that shows the kind of things that go on within a winery. 6 meters does not cut it. So we needed necessarily to expand the building to 10 meters will be 4 meters taller than the scheme that was submitted and 40% larger. So how do you hide that in the landscape? The building sits on a 12-degree slope, which is great for grapes, but not great for accessibility. And then biodiversity in agriculture seems to be at odds. How do you explain the vineyard yet maintain biodiversity if you're expanding into habitat? Wine tourism is critical for the vineyard. It accounts for 30% of sales, so the visitor center is important. But the AONB was opposed to widening of the country lane, as was suggested, which was what was suggested by highways as a means of dealing with potential increase in traffic. So the key consultants were the client on vineyard operations, the planning officer, planning consultant, AONB officer, biodiversity officer, structural and civil engineer, and an ecologist. We went through various options for the scheme. This was actually our take on the scheme that was produced and pre-app by the previous architect. And then in consultation with AONB, we actually floated this idea, what if we had a single building? It didn't look like a farm building necessarily, but we buried it within the site to hide it. And surprisingly, AONB were very amenable to the idea. So we worked further on this idea, working with the AONB and with our civil engineer, and we came up with a scheme where we excavated and buried the building within the site. She was concerned about the access road into the site and was suggesting that we build a bund next to it. So very, very usefully, we had about 200 cubic meters of spoil that we could use to hide the road by building a bund to the site. Working with the civil engineer, we came up with a more detailed scheme for it. We were originally thinking of half burying the building to the site, but in discussion with him, he was actually suggesting, for practical reasons, it made more sense to bury the building totally into the site, so that when you come to the top of the access road, the yard and the ground floor, the kind of operation area of the site, is actually level with the top of the road. This means we have a 10-meter tall building set within the site, which has a rise of 14 meters and a screen of trees which are 12 meters tall. So effectively, it buries the building completely. We then had this idea of splitting visitors and operations, so that for health and safety reasons, also to organize the building, so that you have a separate entrance for visitors with a 4-meter height clearance, so that when you get to the top of the site, fire engines can turn and still have the visitor center go over it. So what you end up with in the end is a site building which is buried pretty much in the site. In the hillside, you have your kind of visitor center, which is peeking out and looking over. The blue is kind of the natural slope of the building. And this is how it looks within the context. Biodiversity was another issue. We had 5-acre vineyard needing to expand into this area. Was a local wildlife area, low quality cultivar grassland. How do we reconcile that? Well, came up with the idea. The ecologists came up with an idea for an enhanced habitat area for beefing up the hedges and scrublands to the side, to the base of the hill, but also very cleverly was specifying grass mix between the vines. So every piece of ground which was not cultivated land was actually contributing to biodiversity. Selling it to the client was a bit harder because, obviously it's losing cultivated valuable land. But the ecologist was able to demonstrate that actually biodiversity improves the quality of the wine by bringing in pollinators and improving soil quality. The last hurdle we had to deal with was transport. And we did this by looking closely at how wine trails and wine tours and wine tastings are actually operated by these tour operators. And most of them use minibuses that take 14, 15 passengers. Agricultural staff are also brought into site by minibuses. So at peak periods on the weekend, let's say if you had 60 visitors to the site, and let's say 70% of them were brought in by tours, instead of having 30 cars, you probably have 3 to 4 minibuses and a few cars. So working that way, we were able to come up with a kind of scheme for sustainable transport that reduced impact on local roads. So to wrap up, if you have a difficult planning application, sometimes you have to take the difficult route because that's what the project needs. And in that value, collaboration is incredibly valuable. the quality of your consultants, and everyone has to be on top of the game, is very useful, and you can actually, through the process, improve the design and find solutions that touch all bases: the needs of the building, the needs of the client and the project, the checks and balances of planning, and a design solution that meets them all. Thank you very much.
So Kasan, what do you think was the actual catalyst for that sort of very innovative solution? What was the one thing that triggered the very clever way of getting over the issues? I can't hear you, Hathan.
A very good pre-app was incredibly useful for us to bounce off. I mean, you look at 9 pages and your heart will sink, but actually it gave us a lot of ammunition to work with. So that was actually the starting point for it. Okay,
thank you very much. And I think now, Georgie, we're going to hear from you from the perspective of the ecologists. You good to go?
Hi, yes. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Yeah, hi, I'm Georgie. I'm a principal ecologist at a consultancy called ECOSA. We're based in North Baddesley, Hampshire. And I wanted to talk about obviously interdisciplinary collaboration, working together, but from give a bit of a perspective from the ecologist perspective. So I know a lot of people feel, or a lot of people in the development sector feel like ecology is quite synonymous with problems. And the start is always the ecological impact assessment process, which starts with the identification of constraints and opportunities. But often the focus is on the constraints. And I understand why the constraints can be costly in terms of time and money, but in a lot of cases, really strong interdisciplinary collaboration can mitigate and avoid those constraints. And then you can turn your attention to maximising the opportunities. So for sort of brief lunchtime CPD format, what I'm planning on doing is going through 3 collaboration scenarios that I commonly encounter in my 7 years that I've been at ECOSA when working on development projects. So I was going to use a hypothetical and extremely simplified case study and some cheesy stock photography. So hopefully this will demonstrate how different types of collaboration affect the ultimate outcomes of the project in terms of ecology, and also in terms of the wider either constraints or benefits for other disciplines. So the case study, as I said, very simplified. The picture, top left picture, is the majority of the site. It's a small field, very well grazed, not very interesting habitat. And say the client wants to put maybe 100 or so homes on there. But this bottom picture is the southeastern corner, so it's not been grazed for whatever reason, maybe it's a bit wetter. And the key point for this case study is that it has suitability for great crested newt. So scenario 1, unfortunately, pretty common, usually with people who haven't come across ecological constraints before. So sometimes homeowners or maybe even more experienced developers who haven't maybe just got lucky in the past and haven't had those ecological constraints affect their project. So we'll get an email saying, we need ecology surveys. How soon can you do them? Determination is Friday. They've obviously planned the project, they've done it all, and maybe they see ecology as a bit of a tick box exercise. So the ecologist always tries to be helpful. But with great crested newt issue, you can only do surveys in a very small spring window. So that would be April. So if you come to us in July, it's really too late to do the surveys. So the client's usually pretty unhappy about that. And we always do try and deliver other solutions. In this case, the only other solution would be to avoid any impacts. So if the suds pond needs to be in the southeast of the site, the avoidance of the impact would be to avoid putting it there. But unfortunately, the scheme's already designed at that point. It's going to cause a huge amount of problems for all other disciplines to do that. So we normally get quite a lot of pushback on that. And whilst we do try and do our best to come up with solutions, sometimes there is no other solution, and the result is usually a pretty unhappy project manager. So scenario 2, project manager takes the lead. This is quite often an evolution from the first scenario. Maybe they've been stung by a constraint before and they're very focused on avoiding the constraints. So the drainage engineer might say they want to put the suds pond in the southeast of the site, and the project manager is fine with that. They then follow up with a call to the ecologist and say, I need some high-level recommendations. What do I need to know? And the ecologist will say, well, the southeast of the site might support great crested newt, so that's probably, everywhere else is pretty easy to deal with, so I just avoid affecting that area. The project manager goes away and just takes that key message away, and goes to the drainage engineer and says, we can't put the suds in southeast of the site. The ecologist said no, can we move it? And the drainage engineer may say we can, but it will cost money, we need to re-level the site, it's not ideal. But the project manager, maybe having been stung by the great crested newt issue in the past, doesn't want to deal with that. The ecologist has said no, let's just move the suds pond. So in this example, it's a better result. The wildlife offences have been avoided, the scheme is likely to get planning, but the suds pond location has been compromised, that's cost money, and there's been no real benefits delivered. It's just avoiding the constraints. So everyone's done the right thing in that scenario. The project manager is trying to do the right thing, the ecologist is trying to do the right thing, and the drainage engineer is trying to do the right thing, but there hasn't really been that strong intercollaboration to deliver real gains. So the final example, and this is fortunately something that I get to deal with regularly with our regular clients. We've built this relationship and they know where the ecology fits into the process. We will often have regular multidisciplinary design team meetings, and that can be a three-way call between a homeowner, an architect and ourselves, or it can be an all-day event with tens of stakeholders and other consultants. So in this example, the drainage engineer has pointed out the suds pond needs to be in the southeast corner of the site. PM's happy with it, but the ecologist can step in and say there's some constraints there. But in contrast to the previous example, there's an open dialogue for us to say, well, it's a constraint, but we can work around it. There can be precautionary methods. We might need to do surveys if that's not if it's not possible to work around that. We might need a license. So the project manager can then immediately ask what that kind of delay would be, and they've once again picked up on the delay and aren't keen on that idea. So ask the drainage engineer, can we move it? Drainage engineer says it will be costly, but then again, with this open dialogue, we can compare the costs of the delay and the cost of the survey against those costs, and it turns out it's still going to be cheaper to do the surveys and deal with the delay. So that can all be bottomed out in a single conversation. It also allows the opportunity for enhancements to be identified. So the ecologist might say, can we make the suds pond 2 meters deep? Can it hold water? And if the drainage engineer says that's okay, then we've actually created an opportunity, an enhancement for the great crested newts by creating new breeding opportunities. And once that pond's been established in that area, the master planner might step in and say, right, well, if we're going to do that and we need to retain that area in that way, we can make that the focus of the open space. And once that's open space, we can then, the ecologist can step in and say, right, well, we can enhance the grassland, and liaise with the landscaper about how that might be achieved. And not only that, but in this current climate of the economic linking environmental benefits and economic benefits in terms of net gain credits, those enhancements can provide wider benefits to the scheme. So by the end of this conversation, we've not only provided enhancement for wildlife, we've provided enhancement for the residents of the new development in creating a more attractive area of open space, and got the client, the project manager, some additional net gain credits that they can use to offset impacts in other parts of the site. So hopefully that has demonstrated what a fundamental difference those methods of communication can have on the outcomes of a project, not just for ecology, but for other disciplines as well.
Great, thank you, Georgie. Just one quick question from me. What do you think the impact of the mandatory biodiversity net gain is going to have on ecology in terms of where it sits within site appraisals?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been important to deal or to address ecology constraints early in the process because of the time constraints and financial constraints. But with this offsetting, it's going to be even more important. I think the key thing there is that with our current process, we only look at things that are important ecological features which have legal protection or conservation importance. With the biodiversity net gain, that ascribes a value to all natural features. So even if it's a very small one, by comparison, you really need to be considering the overall biodiversity value of the site and how you're going to offset that. And so looking at that early in the process gives you the most opportunity to maximise your enhancements on site and reduce the need for financial contributions or off-site compensation, which is always more complicated than delivering it on site.
And I really like the three examples that you gave. I just wonder if there's a fourth one, which is after you've agreed the plans, the engineers come along and want to stick a drain or a sewer or a road where it shouldn't. So maybe that could be the next time we ask you, you could add that to your list.
Yeah, if there's a little more time, I've got a few others.
Esther, are you ready to now give us the heritage perspective?
Yes, I am. So, hello, I'm Esther Robinson Wild, a historic environment consultant. I provide advice on the historic built environment and archaeology, primarily in the context of planning and development. I'm an accredited archaeologist and I sit on the board of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. I also have a background in real estate finance, so I understand development, economics and viability as well. Something that's sort of in relation to the collaboration element of this, and noting in the sort of the synopsis of this webinar, there was a mention of positive impact on society through collaboration. I have a particular interest in regeneration of historic buildings and areas using heritage as a catalyst for change. And I'm quite pleased to see an increasing number of local planning authorities who are using heritage and repurposing historic buildings for housing and reviving historic town and city centres. And sort of this collaboration on that larger conceptual scale, using heritage as that catalyst is great to see. And I'll quickly touch upon that a bit later in the sort of the context of collaboration. I was very pleased to be asked to contribute to the webinar, as collaboration is an important topic and I find essential to creating successful project outcomes. I have experience of projects where my being brought on to the project team in the early stages of the project and my working with architects and planners, specifically conservation officers and or local authority archaeologists, have led to sort of successful projects. But I also have experience, which unfortunately is fairly common, of projects where the historic environment is an afterthought, and so by default may bring about challenges or issues where actually they don't have to be, creating challenges and issues if you think about them early on in the sort of the project scheme. So in those instances, the projects have sort of endured numerous design iterations as a consequence and delays to the development timetable, and all of which can impact on project economics and viability. I have a very short amount of time, but I'll briefly provide examples of two projects, sort of generic, just one large, one small development, which highlights some of the challenges that can be encountered when a historic environment consultant isn't brought on early in the project, and also the benefits we had of early engagement and collaboration. So an observation from experience is that frequently the focus can be solely on the site or the historic building or buildings, and any proposed development, it sort of doesn't necessarily give or limited or little regard to the immediate or wider context of the site. Now, sometimes this is to be expected when considering the fundamental factors of viability and feasibility, which influence design and density, amongst others. But the primary disadvantage of that approach is that when dealing with a site situated in an area where historic environment considerations are important, which is widely applicable in the UK, or a historic building or buildings, is that there's an absence of understanding of that wider context or the significance of the buildings, can potentially impact the actual scheme going ahead, and result in increased costs for the client as a consequence of scheme alteration and delays to the development timeframe. I mean, those are the key things that I often see and experience. So one of the main benefits is of bringing a consultant like me on early on into a project is understanding of the site, that wider context, and more importantly, what the local planning authority may want from a development, especially if it's a major development site that's referred to in local plans. So I engage with the conservation officer and or local planning authority archaeologist early on to understand their views on development and where impact mitigation may be required, maybe some of the benefits that they see to the from the development in terms of heritage and sort of improving the wider sort of realm, environment. But also it's interesting to engage in terms of impact mitigation around the perspective of height, mass and scale. So as was the case with this large development that I worked on. So understanding early on can prevent those numerous design iterations, and so working together with the architect and the planners, the project can sort of hopefully move along much more efficiently. So in that larger development example, the site was situated in a sensitive historic area from the perspective of not only the built environment, but also buried archaeology. And that's a key thing. It may not necessarily be, the significance may not be immediately obvious, it may be buried. And so not factoring in those historic environment considerations early on did lead to changes to the design and also delays to the project timeframe. So the benefits of having a consultant with archaeological expertise on board is that the impacts have been mitigated, and archaeology related costs have been kept to a minimum because of that collaboration with the local authorities archaeologist. And also we've got the benefits of improved interpretation of the historic environment as a consequence of the development. So, as Georgie said, with sort of the ecology perspective, there are benefits to be had if you do consider heritage at the beginning and not see it necessarily as an issue. So essentially, when dealing with a site in a historic area or containing historic buildings, that collaboration between the consultants, the local planning authority and the architects is an exercise in managing expectations, really, and importantly, the client's expectations. So on this, just this one additional point as well in terms of collaboration, is always advisable to be aware of statutory consultees who may respond to planning applications. So people like the Victorian Society, Council for British Archaeology, and I always make a point of raising this with project teams as well, because they can, their views are taken on board and can sort of impact the planning application process. So very swiftly moving on to another example of the smaller development. This is a site that was formerly a substantial country house constructed in the early 20th century. It incorporated a large 15th century farmhouse, and the early 20th century element was substantially destroyed by a fire, and thankfully the 15th century element survived. So here, the architect I've worked with before, we've worked, he's very much understanding historic environment and also the significance of buildings. So we've worked from the early stages on collaborating on design for the new building, and I advise on how to approach that remaining 15th century element and other conservation related aspects. I've also been brought on board to engage with the conservation officer. It's a significant building. So we're now at a pre-application stage, which is being taken forward on the basis of that sound understanding of the significance of the site, and also understanding the conservation officer's concerns and views on what form the new development can take. So again, collaborative working, it's helping to manage the client's expectations and hopefully lead to a successful outcome and an efficient planning application submission. Again, the pre-application process is really important to try and take on board early on any views that the local planning authority, as the decision maker, may want to sort of impart. So lastly, I mentioned earlier the regeneration aspect and that increasing number of local authorities using heritage as catalyst for change. I note this to address that other point about collaboration and the positive impact on society. So heritage-led regeneration has an important role to play in shaping more prosperous and environmentally sustainable places. Communities partly manifest through a city or town's historic assets and spaces, and many of which house important local services and businesses and projects. So the historic environment contributes significantly to people's quality of life, and I think that increased collaboration between historic environment consultants, architects and planners can have a tangible positive impact on society and well-being. And that's my last point, really.
Thank you, Esther. I'm just conscious of the time, so I am going to go straight across to Paul, Head of Planning and Building at Test Valley. If you do a quick introduction, Paul, and then give us your insight and perspective from a local authority's viewpoint, but you have also got extensive experience of the private sector as well.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I've been working far too long in planning now, 38 years in the South East, working for a number of local authorities. Primarily in development management, albeit I did have a stint working for a house builder, which was quite an eye-opener as well, certainly from a planning perspective, which wasn't high on their agenda in terms of getting things done. However, I had my stint there and learned a huge amount from it. In terms of general interests, my general interests are building. I started off actually by not the usual route into planning, but through building construction and management. So I'm quite an unusual planner from that side of things, and have a keen interest in conservation. And I also had the pleasure of building a passive house 6 years ago, which was a major achievement, one of the first in Hampshire as well. So I've got sort of quite a broad range of interest. And happen to head up a planning service in Hampshire, Test Valley Borough Council. Sort of fashionable at the moment to think of 3 words to describe working together and getting things done. And the 3 words I was thinking about was communication, quality and understanding. And I'll elaborate on that a bit more. And it was really interesting listening to all the other speakers, how you're all aligned in terms of start off right and the project will probably end up right. If you end up bringing the experts and the specialists in at the end of the process, or middle of the process, or just when we're writing our reports, chances are you'll have a mess that you need to sort out. And I can't emphasize that enough. And so I got sort of 5 points I was going to go through quite quickly. The first one was, and these are really basic things, but time and time again, they're the things that are forgotten when we start a project, or when a project commences and lands on my officers' desks. Know your site. Again, all the speakers, the starting point was know the site, know the issues, know the constraints, the opportunities that come forward. But more importantly, understand the surroundings of the site. The number of times, if I dare say, there's architects, agents, applicants, they may have looked at the site, but they've not looked at what's going on around it. Get to understand the place. We talk about placemaking, but 9 times out of 10, most people have helicoptered into a site, they look at the site, they don't look beyond the site. And what we need to do is make sure we understand the place to make sure the development that's being proposed fits in. Understand the politics. I know politics don't get involved in planning, of course, but you need to understand the politics. You need to understand the drivers in the area. They can be local politics, they can be parish councils, they can be councillors. Get to understand that if you can, particularly on significant projects. Again, everybody's talked about site surveys. How many planning applications do we receive where you've got sloping sites and you haven't even got a starting point of a site survey, and then we're expected to make decisions on applications? So really understand the site, understand the constraints right at the beginning. That's not just consultants submitting applications, but also officers. When they receive a planning application, they need to get to understand the site properly so they can make proper informed recommendations and decisions. The second area, which is really important, is pre-applications. There's a lot of talk about this. The government encourage it. However, in the majority of cases, we don't receive a pre-application for applications we're dealing with. And I'm not just talking small extensions here. We can be dealing with major planning applications where we've had no inkling of the application until it lands on our desks. And so we're always starting on the back foot when we're in that situation. But also it's really important that when we get pre-applications, the pre-applications have some quality around them. I think the old adage of rubbish in, rubbish out. If we receive a really poor pre-application, chances are the advice you're going to get back is pretty poor. So help us to help you by making sure that the quality of the pre-application, the information that we get, is a decent base at the start, and that will help us provide you with a response. And if we're going to work properly with you, we equally need to make sure that we give you a good quality response back. We need to make sure we don't just regurgitate policy, we give you clear advice of whether that scheme is acceptable or not. But more importantly, we need to stand by that advice as an authority when we've given it, when the final application is submitted. So clear, meaningful responses is a way of making sure when the application is submitted, it's fit for purpose, and hopefully we can write it up with ease. Good quality applications, one follows the other, doesn't it? With all the right information, with all the right reports. When we receive the planning application, it needs to be good quality. We're talking about heritage. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a so-called heritage statement on important listed buildings, which literally comprises one paragraph submitted by the agent. And then we're expected to go away and make a decision on that application. Or best still, do we do our own research? No, we shouldn't be doing the research. That should be done by the applicant prior to submitting the application. And that goes for all the disciplines we're talking about. And again, we've heard that this morning from the various speakers. Consultees need to be clear when they're responding. So when we get planning applications in, if we're going to work together properly, consultees need to be clear in their responses. If there's a problem, what is that problem? Can the problem be resolved? Yes or no? It shouldn't be that difficult, but we seem to wrap up all our responses with words that really don't really say anything, and we need clarity over our responses. So clarity in terms of the submission, and clarity out to help those working relationships. And what we need from the development industry is also for them to support the officers, because we're going to have to make a recommendation to a committee who, in a lot of the cases, you might be surprised by this, are not supportive of a planning application, primarily because their residents are not very supportive of applications. We can't do it on our own, so we really need you to help us. And when we've got issues, officers need you to provide us with the information to overcome the problems you've got. Communication, this is a real issue for me. The modern age of email prevents people from picking up the phone and having a conversation. Get to know the agent, get to know what their drivers are, what their applicants' drivers are. Believe it or not, most agents are quite reasonable in my experience. They just want answers so they can talk to their clients and give their clients advice. And so, you know, pick up the phone rather than emailing, because you can break the barriers down and prevent misunderstanding right at the start. That all takes effort, but we need to make that effort if we're going to improve and get things done. My final point, I suppose this is local authority harping on about resources, skills, and experience. I think we do have problems in local authorities. We don't have the experience. We certainly don't have the resources in a lot of places. And this is an area that we really need to focus on to make sure that we are working together and that we understand each other. And that understanding is really important. You need to understand our position. You need to understand what we're battling with 9 times out of 10. I think if we get that lot right, then hopefully we'll be able to deal with applications reasonably quickly and get you and your client the outcome that they want. But we also have to recognise that there will be occasions when we'll butt up against each other. And I think if we accept that, but work through it professionally, hopefully we can work in a manner that's fit for purpose for all of us. I'll leave it there, Steve, for now.
Thank you, Paul. I think you said you've got 5 points, and I know my maths is pretty poor, which is why I'm not good at housing land supply, but I think I got down 8 there. But each of them were all well made, and hopefully that's particularly the youngsters who might be listening and watching. It's very good advice from an experienced planner. If you recall at the outset, I set everybody that question. Paul's already cheated because he's got down about 8 things, not 1 thing, but I'm going to ask him to maybe focus on 1. But first, going to Kasan, what is the 1 thing do you think you could do to improve the working together? And then I'll come on to Georgie and Esther and then
Paul. The 1 thing I could do to improve things working together is to have more meetings, which is easier said than done. But the case study that we showed was actually a lockdown project. And fascinating thing we learned through the lockdown project was actually it was easier to set up meetings because you didn't have to physically go and arrange 3, 4, 5 different individuals to sit in the same room and have the meeting. So through these apps, like the one we're using now, we were able to arrange amazing meetings that previously would have taken a month to arrange, and we were able to arrange it within a week. So, getting the biodiversity officer and the ecologist and the client and ourselves in the same meeting together to discuss a problem, fantastic. So hopefully that's the solution to meetings.
Yeah. And who would have thought we'd be saying that as a result of a sort of pandemic, that actually we might be talking to people even though we're locked down?
Yeah.
Georgie, what would you recommend from an ecologist point of view? And did you realise that we're only about 3 miles apart, because I'm sat here in Romsey and you said you're in North Baddesley?
Yeah, absolutely. We should collaborate more. Yeah, first of all, I completely agree with Kasan. I've had that experience myself since this lockdown. The other day we had a project that had a really urgent issue and needed multiple disciplines to get involved, and we were able to have a meeting that afternoon via video chat and basically rectify the issue within an hour, which before everyone was in the habit of using these softwares, it just wouldn't have happened. So I think that's really beneficial. For me, for all ecologists all the time, it's always early engagement is the most important thing for us, because of the time constraints associated with ecology, because we can't negotiate with animals, we can't tell them there's a hard deadline that needs to be met. So yeah, I think that always helps so much, and with a lot of our regular clients now, they'll even have us walk over a site before they've purchased it, as one of the first people on site, because most constraints you can work around, but some it's just not going to be worth it, and to get to that point when you've already sunk so much into it, when just a phone call would have highlighted that issue at the very start, I think that's, yeah, invaluable. And also for us, it just gives us time to think about what we can do to maximise the opportunities on that site. The longer we have to work before a hard deadline, the more we can give in terms of advice, and the more we can come up with those really good ideas to maximise the opportunities there.
Excellent. Esther, your word of wisdom.
Well, I think do more of this, actually. I think it's really important that we are a bit more visible. I think, taking Paul's point about one-page heritage statements, I'd like to think that my fellow consultants don't produce reports of that, but admittedly there is variable quality in sort of what's submitted. I think it's important to communicate that we have standards and guidance, and yeah, just more advocacy really, and try to sort of, I know it's not easy negotiating heritage sometimes, and that's for a variety of reasons, but it's trying to sort of, you know, praise the benefits of it and engaging with that, and just taking Georgie's point as well about sort of that before someone acquires a site, that's something that I'm also, in terms of advocacy, it's really important. Some things you just can't get around, or at least not in the context of what you want to get from a development, and actually bringing a consultant, a historic environment consultant, on board at that pre-acquisition due diligence stage, I think is really quite beneficial, because you know, I see examples where someone has acquired a site from someone who tried to get 3 different schemes on that through planning, and they've simply not done it, but they come along and buy the site and think they're going to do something drastically different, and fundamentally they can't. So yeah, I think more of that, just getting out there and speaking to people and say, just think about it even before you buy the site, speak to us. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul, have you distilled your long list into a shorter list?
Well, Steve, it wouldn't be like me not to just to say one thing, would it? But it was interesting, Esther. I'd welcome a one-page report on occasions. I get 1 paragraph. I have to say, though, that bear in mind that the majority of applications we receive are submitted by non-specialists or non-members of the Royal Town Planning Institute or RIBA. So the majority of applications local authorities are dealing with are submitted by plansmiths. I don't want to knock surveyors, but surveyors, and they don't focus on those issues. But sort of moving to the sort of question that you asked, Steve, yeah, I've got several things that I could focus on, but I think Kasan sort of really hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned, and that was more meetings, which basically equals communication. Interestingly, virtual meetings from a local authority perspective are making a big difference in terms of our time. Getting to sites, getting from sites. We've got a borough that's 18 miles long. From one end to the other end, it takes you 40 minutes. We're saving that time. So we should take that and use that as an opportunity to communicate more. But the one thing I would say then, because Kasan stole my one thought, was more drawing, less words. I think nowadays we focus so much on words. We don't spend enough time analysing the site, analysing design quality. And as a result, a significant number of schemes we receive are really poor quality in design terms. And that's an area we significantly need to raise. The government are talking about that at the moment, about better development, quality development. But to be quite frank, the majority of stuff that crosses my desk, well, we're in polite company, but it's pretty poor in the extreme. And so more drawing, less words.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I've been keeping an eye on the questions which have obviously been flooded in. We had 4 from the same person who had a mute problem, and now it's been sorted, they've had to leave the meeting. So I think we'll just carry on talking amongst ourselves. And the other question which Esther has actually sort of preempted in terms of saying we should do more of this. One of my sort of bugbears over the years is the lack of relationships between the professions. So for example, in Hampshire, there's a landscape group, an ecology group, a policy group, development managers group, there's a tree group. I can't remember them ever coming together as one group. And that's from when I used to chair all in the overview sort of group. And so I'm thinking my question this time is, and we'll go in reverse order. So Paul very quickly, and then Esther, Georgie and Kasan is, do you think there's merit in trying to create more collaboration between the professions at whatever level, whether it's at the institute level, but more appropriately perhaps at a more local level, to try and share some of the sort of issues that we've been talking about today, but also try and find some of the solutions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I suffer even within my own department to get everybody communicating and to get everybody to understand each other's professions. And I really think that we need to spend more time on that issue of understanding each other and our professions, working more together. although I recognise it's a big ask. I mean, we're talking about a mammoth subject area. Even if you look at the most simple planning applications, the number of disciplines involved, the number of issues involved, for people to fully understand all of those issues is quite hard. But I don't think that should stop us. I think we need to spend more time in each other's disciplines so we understand it better, so we understand where we're coming from. There's never a better time than spending half an hour with a tree officer at Test Valley and listening to him to talk about trees as a planner. I'm not a specialist, I'm a planner. Because I learned so much in half an hour, and we don't do anywhere near enough of that. You know, time with an archaeologist, time with a heritage consultant. A few years ago, I went out to see a building that we were potentially going to list with the conservation officer. It was quite touchy, that's why I was involved. Walking around with that heritage specialist was absolutely fascinating in terms of the knowledge and what was important. And all of a sudden, I was just looking at this red brick building that I thought was just a red brick building. And all of a sudden, I realised there was something really special here and something that we really need to list. So, yeah, definitely.
Esther, you started this ball rolling.
Yes, I do think that there's that sort of getting together and understanding what other people do in the process. I think that's the thing. And I think with the heritage side of things, it's sort of just trying to say we can be helpful and not standing on a site going, oh, it'll cost you, sort of type thing. I think that's the thing. It's just sort of giving more of a around it, sort of, you know, what we can do and how we can help in a positive way, rather than sort of, you know, a constraint in terms of the economics. I mean, for me, it would be interesting, I think, more time with architects, actually. I work with them, I'm engaged with them, and I think it would just be really helpful, because I do experience where some consultees do just say, well, why can't you just put windows on that side, on that elevation, and, you know, just sort of throw back all of these comments and don't really sort of quite understand, you know, it's not that simple, and quite frankly, we're not architects, you know, so that's where it is that collaboration. There is a point at which I can advise, but fundamentally I need that expertise, and I think I would like to know more about it, and I think that spending time, you know, with an architect going through that scheme, you know, real in depth, that we don't do, I touch upon, and I think quite a lot of my colleagues in the sector would benefit from that as well, and then comments would be much more targeted and realistic, I think. So, yeah.
Thank you. Georgie, how much contact do you have with non-ecology people in terms of perhaps the learning experience that Paul was talking about?
Yeah, it can be quite variable. I mean, I love design team meetings. It's one of the favourite bits of my job, because like Paul said, I've never gone to a design team meeting and not walked away knowing something I didn't know when I went in, and understanding the project that I'm working on in a different light, looking at it in a different way. And you have to consider other disciplines, because you can't just look at it in that two-dimensional level. Well, stick it there then. You know, you need to know why you can't stick it there. And I think that's what the whole collaboration process and those design team meetings work really well for that. I think in some disciplines we work really well, and we're very aware of each other's constraints, opportunities. Tree specialists and ecologists normally go pretty hand in hand. Loads of tree specialists know a lot about that. And then there's some disciplines which, in my personal experience, and I can't put my finger on why, landscape and ecology are really interlinked, but ecologists don't tend to know a huge amount about landscaping beyond what's relevant to ecology, and landscapers don't seem to know a huge amount about ecology in a lot of cases. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I don't quite know why those two don't marry up quite as well as the tree specialism. Or again, heritage and bats goes quite well together. I think it's just how often we directly come across constraints to each other, because I think for some, like with the bats, it can be a very hard hit against the two disciplines, whereas landscaping and ecology is very soft. It's sort of, you can normally get away with this and that. So I don't know if it's that, but I do think that's an area that I would like personally to know more about and get a bit more linked together.
Perhaps you're both using the wrong version of Latin, and so that's why you can't understand.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is the landscape plants are weeds to us, and our plants are weeds to them. So I think that's part of the problem.
Kasan, your observations. I'm just conscious of the time. We've got about another 6 minutes to go, so we'll perhaps go and do some final comments after Kasan's input.
Okay, well, as the architect, usually there's usually not one specialism that we aren't in contact with. We have to have a broad outlook on everything, and we need to be in touch with all aspects of it. Thank God we've gone away from the days of validation checklists, because that really encouraged you to think of the whole process as a tick box process. But the flip side of that is finding the right collaborators and building up the relationship with them takes a long time. So, you know, it's over 20 years of practice. We've built up people that we go for. We look for people who are passionate about what they do, they're knowledgeable and proactive, who come up with ideas. So, for example, you know, you talk about landscape and ecology. Acoustics and ventilation is another one that's often at odds. But I have an acoustic consultant who I actually, when I speak to him, I have to hold the phone away, because 70% of what he says goes over my head. But I know that 30% that I understand can help me solve a problem. But finding those people and building up those relationships takes time, but it's absolutely worth it, because like I hopefully demonstrated the project, you can come up with solutions. If you've got the right team, you can find a solution for everything. And if that trusted team member tells you it can't be done, then you know it can't be done. You know, if they say this is an absolute risk and you know it will be an absolute dog's dinner to go into this, then you can actually call up your client and say, don't buy that site. Try something else. Do something else, because this is the wrong thing for you to invest your money in.
Yeah. I think the one thing I would say, if somebody used to write plans, it would be helpful if people read the local plan. I got involved in a case a couple of years ago where I was brought into a site, and I said, well, you've got a bit of a problem here because you're in the green belt. And the agent was, are we? And I just could not believe that they hadn't just done that one thing, which was just look on the proposals map of wherever it was. I can't remember now. Yes, I can. And it was just unbelievable. So the problem then was I wrote a report explaining why it would be pretty tricky to get this site, 130 houses, where the number was. And it looked like the planner was creating a problem because the person wanting to buy the site had already assumed it was all right. And I think that's part of planning's problem, is we're often the harbingers of bad news. Not old news, just bad news that hasn't been sort of picked up on. So I think it all comes back to, I think we've all sort of said, is know the site. You need to do that bit of research, and if you don't, you are, you know, likely to head for a fall. So we've got a couple of minutes. So I don't know if any of the panelists, sorry, Kasan, I've got something to say.
I think one of the obstacles we constantly come up against is that clients, lay people, the man on the street, don't understand the planning process. They see it primarily as an obstacle rather than a check and a balance. So when you're thinking about, you know, those sites that you talk about, checking local plan on that, that's accessible to everyone. But I think only specialists or some specialists look at it. If clients or developers purchasing a site, you know, developers purchasing a site, they don't even look at that. A lot of them don't even look at the local plan, what the baseline constraints are, and then they go and buy the site. There's an educational process to the man on the street that needs to happen that changes the perception of planning as a problem, I think.
Okay, anybody got any final thoughts before I wrap up? I think we've enjoyed ourselves. I'm not sure how many people have actually listened to it, but I'm sure it'll go viral once it gets on YouTube. So I'm going to close now by saying thank you to all four of you for your contributions. I found it sort of really interesting, and certainly working as an independent, i.e. on your own planning consultant, these sorts of events do provide a real opportunity to sort of open your eyes and help the learning. I have to say that we should tell those that are watching and listening that you should tell us what you think on Twitter, and do complete the survey when that appears after this webcam finishes. We're also encouraged to go onto the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/the-RTPI. Not one of my favorites, but I guess it ought to be. So you're notified of all the RTPI's videos as soon as they are released. The next bit's a bit scary. There'll be a recording of this session will go up onto YouTube. So if you're watching the recorded highlights, it's now November. And so please give us a thumbs up and put some comments on it if you think it was worthwhile. So with that, Paul, Esther, Georgie, perhaps we should get together sometime, and Kasan, thank you very much, and thank you for all those who've been watching and listening. Goodbye.